I call the Honourable Minister Peter Dunne.
Mr Speaker, I want to begin by responding to some comments made by an earlier speaker about some of the recent forecast figures in terms of overall revenue. It is not correct to say that the most recent set of statements indicated a $4 billion shortfall in tax revenue. In fact, what those statements indicated was that the largest contributor to the shortfall was a drop-off in earnings on some of the equities that we've invested internationally through bodies like the Earthquake Commission, the ACC, etc. The actual tax component of those figures, Madam Speaker, was approximately between $400 and $700 million. And to put that into its correct context in terms of overall forecasting, that is within the margin of error generally. So the good news is, as far as we're concerned, that the tax cut program that the government has committed itself to, as being announced in this year's budget, can proceed and can proceed on a staged basis. And as someone who was Minister of Revenue the last time this country had personal tax cuts, which was over 12 years ago, I am particularly keen to see personal tax cuts advance now over a 3-year period to build on the business tax cuts that were introduced in last year's budget, to give New Zealanders a dividend for a number of the costs that they have borne over the years of economic restructuring and the fruits of the progress of that restructuring that we've seen in the last few years. So I'm looking forward to what the Minister of Finance may well outline in that regard, because the case is overwhelming. New Zealanders are increasingly saying we cannot carry on paying more and more and getting less and less in return, and we do expect some dividend from government for the contribution that we've made. And tax cuts on a rolling basis would be a very powerful signal in that regard. But there's another lesson to be learned from our recent experience. What New Zealand tends to do periodically is go through a process of reducing taxes and then puts it aside as having done that to be forgotten for time in the future. I said a moment ago that the last time we had personal tax cuts was 1996. It's not good enough to have to wait over a decade for the next round. The business tax cuts that take effect in just a few weeks' time are the first business tax cuts in nearly 2 decades. It's not good enough to have to wait 20 years between business tax cuts. Rather, we need to be embarking on a program of smaller and more regular cuts so that New Zealanders can keep in touch with the rest of the international community. And that's certainly something that United Future is keen to focus on and will be looking to see achieved in this year's budget. But I want to talk about a couple of other issues that are important to New Zealanders as a whole, and where there is the scope this year to make some significant change if the political will is there. Every day we hear stories of waiting lists in the public hospital sector for elective surgery. We have various scandals in some of our smaller district health boards. And yet, Madam Speaker, at the moment, around 150,000, over half of all elective surgical procedures, are carried out each year in the private sector, and only about 2% of the total of those procedures are funded by public hospitals. We have the absurd situation of waiting lists in the public sector, underutilisation of capacity in the private sector. And a country like New Zealand, just over 4 million people, is simply not big enough to run and sustain 2 competing health systems the way we have at the moment. There needs to be integration, there needs to be far more cooperation, and what we ought to be doing, and the only thing that's stopping us at the moment is ideology, is utilising the overcapacity in the private sector to fund some of those shortages, reduce those waiting lists in the public sector. That's not an ideological statement. It's actually a statement of fact and common sense, and through astute utilisation of management and planning it can be attained. And we see that as being a far more productive way ahead, rather than continuing this artificial division that we've got into in recent years. And the upshot of that is that would then enable the public sector to focus on the high-end medical procedures, the very specialist acute surgery, the breakthrough research and so on and so forth that keeps us at the top end. But we cannot do that while we have the problems that we do at the moment. So we want to see significant steps taken this year to allow for greater integration of public and private. This is not about privatising the health system or any of that sort of rhetoric. It's simply about ensuring New Zealanders get access to the operations they need at the time that they need them. You know, you look at the statements from the Ministry of Health about its expectations of what a New Zealander can look forward to in terms of elective surgical procedures. And it's not bold and ringing and inspiring. It's simply a statement that we will endeavour to get you the surgery you require within a 6-month period, or if we cannot do that, we'll explain to you when you might be getting that surgery. Now, if you're hanging out there for a serious operation, if you've got painful hip or knee joints requiring replacement, being told, well, we'll try and do it within 6 months, but if we can't, we'll tell you that when that might happen, is hardly a ringing endorsement. And what we say is that New Zealanders deserve better than that, particularly elderly and vulnerable New Zealanders who do not have the luxury of saying, we'll queue jump by going private. But what we ought to be enabling them to do is get access to their surgery in a timely manner, and we ought to do that through utilising that overcapacity in the private sector. And we see that, it's not a matter of looking at either side of the House. I know that I've got support on that side of the House for this policy, but it is certainly something that can be achieved and ought to be achieved regardless of party lines. This is simply common sense, not ideology. I want to say a couple of other things because they come into the same category. Earlier today there was some criticism of the Families Commission because it announced its intention to undertake a $500,000 program, and I get very angry with our total fixation always on the dollars rather than the quality, about promoting parenting. Parenting is the most important task any one of us can take on, and it does need to be affirmed, and it needs to be affirmed loud and clear and often and clear, because parents will tell you, they've told the Commission, they've told the government, they've told every single one of us that they feel undervalued, they feel underappreciated. And the best way that we can strengthen and enhance families in New Zealand and break down the cycle of dysfunction that so many are suffering from is to enhance parenting, to boost parents, to give them a pat on the back for what they do and make it clear that we as a parliament and a government stand alongside them in that important responsibility. So I applaud the Commission for the work that it's doing, and I hope that as a result of this year's budget it will be in a position to carry on with that program, rolling out support and encouragement for New Zealand parents and giving the parents of today and the parents of tomorrow confidence that they will be supported in the difficult task that they undertake. Madam Speaker, a number of parents feel that their ability to be effective parents is compromised by the student debt that their children incur. And United Future is looking forward to this budget, to the achievement of one of our confidence and supply agreement objectives about a better deal for students through lowering the age at which the parental income test applies for student allowances. And that will be a very positive step also that we would look forward to seeing come through as part of this budget. But there is one other issue I want to raise as time runs out on me, and that is the issue relating to our overall approach to climate change policy. There is general agreement around this House and around this country that we need to develop a clear and coherent response, and it's generally accepted that an emissions trading regime is the best way of achieving that response. But the difficulty we have is that the headlong rush to put that in place may get in the way of resolving a lot of the individual complexities about the particular industry sectors, be it forestry or agriculture, transport or the household sector. And I made the point when the bill was introduced, and it's been borne out by subsequent events, that unless we get the buy-in of those sectors for the achievement of those policy goals, the real fear is that we end up in a situation where firstly the objectives cannot be attained, so there's uncertainty, and secondly where the only certainty is in fact that there is ongoing uncertainty and the need for further amendment. The consequence of both of those leaves us exposed, unprotected and not in a position as a country to make forward progress. So I'm looking forward to this budget giving some strategy and some direction in terms of how we're going to face these issues in a reasonable and coherent way and not rush headlong simply to put in place a regime before this Parliament rises because it suits the government of the day's political advantage to do so. Climate change is not a partisan political issue. It affects every single one of us. It's long-term. It outlasts us as individuals, lives of parliaments, and it needs to be approached on that basis. and it will not work in this country if it's simply seen as the property of the government of the day to introduce and pass as it sees fit, to be amended then by the next government when it sees that what's put in place hasn't been working. So it would be important, as this legislation goes through and as this budget takes effect, that that strategy is produced in a coherent and clear manner. Madam Speaker, with those thoughts, I think if the budget reflects those, New Zealand will continue down the path of reasonably steady growth that it has enjoyed over the last decade or so. But what's important now, increasingly, from people is that the quality of life that they enjoy is recognised and becomes a greater part of the consideration of those issues.
Thank you very much. Rodney Hayes.